Well, I think every reasonable German understands that this question is being put. At the same time, you must understand that many Germans feel it very unjust that this question is being put after 50 years after the war, in which time the free part of Germany has proven to have a very well-functioning democracy, to be an extremely peaceful member of the society of people.
Well, if I may, Mr. Klein, many people believe, while what you've said is quite correct, that Germany, either Germany, had no choice for the last 45 years. Occupation took place for a long time, the division was there, and it is only now that Germany has a chance to get back together and without those kinds of restraints demonstrate whether it's changed or not.
Well, I don't think we Germans considered the last, I don't know how many years, Allied troops in Germany as occupation. We considered them as stationing powers who took care of our security and our freedom. So we didn't feel this, everything we did under pressure of occupation forces. This simply wouldn't be correct. And the way our policy took in those years was the way we decided upon. There was no high commissioner telling us we should go this way or that way, or no American or French or British general threatening, if you don't do that, we'll do that. I think this is a wrong approach. This Federal Republic of Germany used its sovereignty and its free will to go the way it did, and it was a way towards peace, the way towards cooperation, and we were always convinced that Europe's future can only be a future of democracy, and after all, there has never been a war between democracies of modern type. It always needed a totalitarian or a monarchical controversial partner.
Mr. Klein, thank you. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Coming next, Vernon Walters, the United States Ambassador to West Germany, in a moment. Ambassador Walters, we're delighted to have you with us. Thanks for coming. Pleased to have you. Now, with the East and West Germany's about to become one country, democracy spreading over Central and Eastern Europe, Soviet Union on the verge of collapse. Do we need NATO any longer, and if so, what for?
Well, I think we need NATO because it is a primary element in which Europeans and Americans talk to one another and in which they have a feeling of common destiny. All American presidents have come from summits to report to their NATO colleagues in Brussels, and I think it is, after all, we're in a football game, we're leading by about 3 touchdowns at halftime. Do we really want to change everything, including the players?
Well, there's a chance for the president and others to talk friendly fashion. Does it have to be a huge and expensive military alliance like this?
Well, I don't know how huge it has to be. I don't know how much of a military alliance is. I served 10 years in NATO, and I would say it was at least as much political as it was military.
I don't want, Ambassador, to commit you unduly to your metaphor, but are we really only at halftime? What's the second half hold in store here?
I don't know the second half. That's one of my problems. The Soviet Union is certainly no longer the threat it was in the past. But in 1917, the Tsarist army was defeated by the Germans, and the Russians, Lenin and his friends, signed over the Ukraine. But 4 years later, the Red Army arose from that. And I think it's very difficult for us to make decisions on defense of a definitive nature until we know the nature of the oncoming Russian state.
Well, let me ask you about that. Do you think that the Soviet Union, as a coherent political entity stretching from the eastern part of Europe to within 18 miles of Alaska, will 5 years from now exist as a unified state?
Well, that all depends. If Mr. Gorbachev is able to work out something, let me say, tighter than the British Commonwealth, but maybe a little looser than the German federal republic, I think he has a good chance of keeping a number of those people. Some of the people, I think, are going to go inevitably.
Ambassador, why did Chancellor Kohl's government take so long to do anything in the way of real help for the Persian Gulf effort?
Well, you know, the Germans, ever since the war and the accusations of militarism, have been kind of goosey about this sort of problem. And really, let me just tell you my own experience as ambassador, anything they didn't have to do with German unity didn't get much of a hearing until very recently, until President Bush, I think, took the necessary steps to give the Germans the right kind of perspective on just how important this was from the point of view of U.S. foreign opinion.
You mean to read them the Riot Act?
I don't know whether it's reading the Riot Act, but to make them know how important this was in the eyes of U.S. public opinion. And I'm sure the German embassy reported the wave of complaints about the non-participation in the Germans up to that time.
Well, what they've forwarded $2 billion, bring me up to date. Are they going to do more, or is that it?
I believe that's for this year, for the next year. It's an open commitment, as it is for all of us.
Ambassador Walters.
They feel, of course, they have a lot of calls on them now. They're expected to pay off the Russians, to resurrect East Germany, to help resurrect Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and some other countries. And they were a little appalled at the size of the potential commitments.
Ambassador Walters, you're a military man originally, a general, and you've had a lot of experience. You've been our UN ambassador. Are we going to war in the Persian Gulf?
I couldn't tell you that question. I think only Saddam Hussein knows that answer to that question. That's Saddam Hussein and the NATO and the UN Security Council.
If we went to war, would it be a quick one, a surgical one? Would we lose a lot of people?
I'm not going to get into speculating about that. I'm not in the chain of command. I'm not one of the ones that makes the decision in that. And I think we have the kind of leadership which the American people from President Bush seem to approve in an overwhelming fashion. I think we've done everything we've done within the framework of the United Nations, and I think we've got an extraordinary spectacle of the whole world united against one aggressive power. And I'm 73 years old. I've never seen this before.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, we heard Mr. Klein a minute ago saying that there really was no reason for other countries in Europe to worry about German militarism in the future now that it's going to be a single country again. Assuming that is true, what about economic domination? It's going to be by far the richest, strongest economy in Europe and one of the 2 or 3 strongest in the world. Is there anything disturbing in that?
Well, any competition is disturbing. Every company worries about disturbance. This, however, is the smallest Germany in the last 1,000 years and by far the richest. And rich countries are not tempted by military adventures. And it's a large gross national product. I don't know, maybe it's a quarter of ours. And I believe that within Europe you will see, you know, a counterweight to this form between some of the other countries in Europe, that if they sense that the Germans are trying to dominate, they will unite. And if you take, just as an example, Great Britain, France, and Italy, their gross national product is larger than Germany's.
But such coming together in what might be called defensive cooperation against Germany won't be possible, will it, under the European liberalization of trade?
Well, I tell you, things are changing in Europe to a degree that is hard to understand. Yesterday, I went out and I drove from here into France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Holland, and back to Germany, and nobody asked me to show a document of any kind. Things are changing in Europe. Thinking in the old 1914, 1939 terms does not correspond to the Europe of today. There is a freer movement and there is a closeness which has never existed between the European countries. I know. I saw it come from nowhere. I came here with Averell Harriman in May of 1948 to set up the Marshall Plan. And at that time, the gross national product of the countries that now make up the European community was 6% of ours. Now it's larger. And that's good for competition. Ambassador, thank you. I'm sorry our time is up. Thanks very much for being with us. Pleasure to have you. Thank you. Coming next, our discussion here, one thing and another, and joining us will be Cokie Roberts of ABC News. In a moment. Sam, you tried with great lack of success to get some kind of opinion out of General Waters about the future in the Gulf. Is war or peace, or what's going to happen there? He very adroitly said he was not a part of the chain of command and would have nothing to say about it. What do you have to say about it? Are we going to war? Well, what do you think?
All the signals this weekend from people in the Bush administration are that we have concluded that perhaps the blockade is not going to work and we may have to take military action. That may be a psychological ploy on their part.
Is that a message for Saddam Hussein?
It may be, but I think in one sense, the president's in a box. The longer we wait, the more the alliance will fray, the more the problems will develop. And yet, on the other hand, to say it was 1 month ago, David, that Secretary of State Baker sat right here on this program and told us that we were going to institute this kind of blockade. Obviously, a month isn't long enough to give the sanctions a chance to work. So if you say after 1 month or 5 weeks, well, it hasn't worked, off with his head, you clearly don't intend to give him a chance to work.
Well, except for there's a real sense that they can't work. I think that's what's really been building in the last week, is that, you know, we had...
How do you know?
Well, but there's just some feeling now, certainly in this town, that the president's objectives cannot be met with the situation the way it is, that getting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait is just not going to happen with just leaving the embargo in place.
But you just said it. They have made that conclusion not based on the evidence, but based on their theory. Well, you don't know that it's not based on the evidence.
Well, the evidence is 1 month.
The sanctions are beginning to bite. Clearly, they haven't worked yet. But no one, when the sanctions were put into place, said, well, it'll take a month.
Even if the sanctions work, that it's not going to get Saddam Hussein out of there. And I think that's what's beginning to disturb people, that we simply can't get from here to there in terms of what the objectives are the way we are.
That's it. How do we know?
But I'm not quite convinced that the Bush administration is, even in its own mind, convinced as to what the there is. There are large voices in this town who believe that the restoration of the status quo ante is not sufficient. That if you leave Saddam Hussein back in place out of Kuwait, but in possession of all the oil to sell to continue the growth of exotic weaponry that he alone on this planet seems willing to use without restraint.
Poison gas.
Poison gas, and in the fullness of time, say 3 or 4 years, nuclear capacity, that's not satisfactory anymore. So the Bush administration has to decide what's satisfactory. Meanwhile, the conditions conducive to war are there. You have 2 large military forces. You have a perhaps unstable dictator. And you have unsplittable differences. Diplomacy is the splitting of differences, and I don't see the splittable ones here.
You know, just as a citizen, what should George Bush do? You're saying that the only way that you must destroy Saddam Hussein.
I'm saying that those who argue, I'm not sure I subscribe to this fully, but it's very plausible that those who argue that this is the time, that a prophylactic measure against Saddam Hussein now will reduce the level of violence and danger in the world in the long term a lot, and that's a serious problem.
Or against his army. That's, I mean, the 2 choices are always put out there, and it's very interesting. Those voices are on all sides of the political spectrum. You have Democrat Les Aspin saying that at the same time that you have conservative Republicans saying that. You have all kinds of a sense that if you leave Saddam Hussein or his army in the kind of strength that it is, that the danger will be very real. So one whole set of choices is to do in the army.
If you do that, you're just forgetting the idea that we're operating within the United Nations, within the framework of law. We're just going to go do it, because you could have argued just a few years ago that to leave Iran and the Ayatollah Khomeini there with his army, although preoccupied with Iraq at the time, would be very bad for peace. George, let's face it. I read in the newspaper this morning some what I thought were very plaintive voices of our own troops in the Persian Gulf in trying to explain to reporters why they thought we were there. One guy was quoted as saying, we're here to defend the United States. But it was clear he didn't mean it economically. He meant it, as Lyndon Johnson meant it 20 years ago, that if we didn't stop them in Vietnam, they would be in Honolulu tomorrow. We're there because of oil.
No.
We're not there because of oil? We went there to preserve the emir of Kuwait's throne?
No, I think the oil ingredient is necessary for us to have acted, but it's not a sufficient reason. We are there to protect the United States against a rising tide of anarchy, which the president, in his judgment, and it's not implausible, feels would rise had we not drawn a line against this particular dictator.
But the anarchy would not be particularly meaningful if it weren't for the fact that this particular dictator can control 40% of the world's oil reserves and thereby disrupt the economies of all the
If Kuwait were rich in soybeans, we wouldn't be there, perhaps. That's arguable. But then I'm glad they're rich in oil, because it gave the president the occasion to do what he was right to do, which is say this kind of behavior in the world will not be tolerated.
But we are there to preserve the oil flow. We are not there.
No, that's just not true. Well, we're there for the reasons the president gave.
The emir of Kuwait's throne.
The president gave a lot of reasons in his statement, and we ought to take all of them seriously. He was candid and said oil was important, but he was also correct in saying that, in fact, there was aggression, a threat to the orderliness of the world in which we have a stake. That's why they're there. Basically, our army is there because the president sent them there, and that's what armies do.
But our stake, George, is oil, unfortunately. yes, it can be argued that we must stand against aggression. I argued the same thing. I thought Ronald Reagan was right to talk about freedom fighters in many instances. I thought he was wrong, of course, to talk about them only when they were against communism and not when they were freedom fighters against apartheid, for instance.
Well, I made my point twice. Of circumstances, George. Anarchy, yes. Access to poison gas and willingness to use it, yes. The possibility of nuclear weapons pretty soon, yes. Plus seems to me, a crazed dictator in charge of a rather large army.
That's right, and it seems to me, by the way, when journalists come up with a notepad or a microphone in the desert to a 21-year-old soldier and say, "Why are you here?" I don't think we should be alarmed if we don't get geopolitical or international law answers.
Right.
They're there
because I was called
that's they're a volunteer force. They go where they're told to go.
Let me tell you something. We all agree, I think, that it was World War II when we fought the last war in which we all understood why we were doing it and thought it really was a clear and present danger to our homeland. Every war since then has been murkier and murkier.
Oh, but that's
Vietnam
the world we're in now, is a murkier and murkier world. And I think that one of the things that's going to be interesting in the next few weeks, you know, this budget has so taken over everything happening on Capitol Hill, but there have been all kinds of resolutions coming up there, War Powers Act being talked about, all of those things, and that you're now going to hear about that for the next couple of weeks because the president is trying to get the Congress to sign on to this operation, and they're being very wary of it.
The Constitution says Congress has the right to declare war. We've fought over that now for the last 25 or 30 years, saying what did they know about it? Anyway, unless, of course, it's Judge Souter we want to talk about.
We've fought about it, but we've never found the answer. Congress does have the right to declare war, but...
Well, when was the last time they did it?
Well,
World War II.
December 8th and 9th of 1941.
1941, yes. Great deal has happened since then. Now, the Supreme Court meets pretty soon, probably without its newest member-to-be, David Souter, because I don't think it'll be confirmed by then. Is this going to change the basic nature of the Supreme Court? Cokie, what do you think?
Well, one thing that's interesting is that they're taking up all of their major arguments in the first couple of weeks of the session when David Souter won't be there. So that even though he is almost certain to be confirmed and easily confirmed, one vote against him in the Judiciary Committee, it's going to make it harder for them as they make decisions down the pike to not have him there for the arguments.
Well, you can't be certain, obviously, about justices. They change. But I would think, yes, George Bush has consolidated the Reagan majority, conservative majority on the court.
But that's so, George, you think?
I think so. I mean, the most lasting thing that a president can do if he has 8 years, Ronald Reagan did, which is appoint about half the federal judiciary. And by his vice president coming on and continuing the process, you would expect, in the normal course of things, for the court to shift further to the right. It's very hard to read, somewhat Delphic, often obscure, and one suspects deliberately so, answers that Judge Souter gave to the Judiciary Committee. For example, if I thought he was sincere in his encomium to Justice Brennan, I'd be very alarmed, but I don't think he was.
He's given conservatives some cause. Yes, that's
most
true.
Most people will be shocked if he turns out to be the biggest defender of Wade Roe and not overturning it. I mean, that would just blow your mind.
When his confirmation hearings were held, said a lot of things that have turned out to be surprising.
But see, the country
praised Joe McCarthy, the great communist hunter.
We have focused so much on Roe v. Wade. Right. I think that is so unimportant compared to the decisions they're going to have to make regarding affirmative
but that was
action.
the battleground.
But the other thing is that I think it's very interesting. If David Souter, or if George Bush had made his choice after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, it could have been a very different choice from David Souter. I mean, the Democrats are getting the best they can expect under the circumstances.
You mean he could have nominated Robert Bork again and would have gone through?
Or somebody much more like Robert Bork. I think that what you had was a time when the president was having some problem in the public opinion polls, when you had a bunch of Republican candidates for office, particularly Republican women running for the Senate, who went to the president and said, for heaven's sake, don't stick us with some nominee that we're going to have to defend.
But Anthony Kennedy is much like, in fact, in some respects, perhaps even more than Robert Bork, and that's the justice we got when Bork was defeated.
But this nomination, I think, from the point of view of the people who want the court to change least, is probably the best they could have gotten, and it was in a tiny window of time.
Well, now, one other thing before we go. We all know, whether we've seen them or not, we know what X movies are, X-rated movies. They will cease to exist, sort of, because Jack Valenti and the Motion Picture Association have come out with a new label for movies with sexual or violent scenes in them, and it's called NC-17, NC meaning no children under 17. Is that going to make the slightest difference, George?
Well, in the sense that it will reclaim the X rating from the pornographers of the country and allow them to release without the stigma of an X rating serious movies that have content that no children, even accompanied by an adult, should go to. My hope would be that they would do something to strengthen the trend they started with the PG-13 rating that was put on in response to an utterly innocent, rather nice movie called Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, because the violence was so intense in that. And I think the more you talk to adults, policemen, and all the rest, and I've done a lot of both in recent days. I was in the 75th Precinct in New York. Cops talk about the violence the kids are seeing in the movies, and they would like to see Hollywood take
Well, but they're never going to stop that. I mean, I went to the sequel to the
Cokie,
Indiana Jones thing.
Sorry, Cokie, the time is up. I hate to interrupt you.
I have no comment on this question.
Go. And Sam, I'm not even going to comment.
Sorry.
To you.
No pictures.
Not even going to apologize to you. We'll be back with a quick update on this morning's news, what there is of it, in a moment. Finally, as you saw if you were with us about an hour ago, a little less than that, we had two of the negotiators in Congress on the new tax and deficit reduction. They wouldn't tell us much, but what we seemed to learn from them was that the tax rate, income tax rates, will not be changed. There will be limitations on deductions for people in high income brackets, and there's something about Social Security, and they wouldn't quite say what. They're going to let it all out this afternoon, sometime. We don't know yet when. Thank you for being with us, from all of us at ABC News. Until next Sunday, thank you.
This Week with David Brinkley, brought to you by GE. From aircraft engines to appliances, we bring good things to life. And by ADM, supermarket to the world. For a transcript, send $4 to This Week with David Brinkley, 267 Broadway, New York, New York, 10007, or call 212-227-READ.
A presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.
Watch ABC's World News Tonight with Peter Jennings for national and international news, reported as only the people of ABC News can. ABC News, America's choice.